Towards the end, the slides will not be as good as they are at the beginning, but never mind. But you may have noticed that the title is different from the one that appears in the abstracts. Is pantomime the elephant or the sense of touch? What we see as we look at different papers, we see pantomime as the key to language in my case, as the key to pedagogy in Peter Jardenfusch's case, as the key to narrative in Francesco Ferretti's case. And so the question is pantomime the elephant? In other words, is the real thing that pantomime is about language or pedagogy, or is it rather the sense of touch? And so each time we look at pedagogy or language or narrative, it's our way of touching part of the elephant. And what then is the elephant? Perhaps it is the human ability to communicate as we act within a world that is both physical and symbolic. So that's the idea. And I've tried to structure this talk in respect of the honor of being asked to give the opening talk as one that will open up a number of conversations. And in particular, it will already anticipate some of the issues I hope we debate this afternoon in the round table. So now the next thing is how to advance the slides. Ha 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 ha. Does this work?
This may work.
This may work.
I think that's a highlight. That's, yeah, if you want.
No, this was the...
Yeah.
This is so exciting. All right, I apologize for the imperfections. I can only hope that my imperfections provide lessons for the later speakers who can all be perfect. Okay, part one, introduction. So, here is the sort of framework that, for me, the elephant has been proto-sign as a route to language in MSH, the mirror system hypothesis, for Peter Jardenfusch, pedagogy, for Ferretti, narrative, and the you question is because others of you have your own potential elephants. And so the idea is to get us started in thinking about not which one of us is right or which is the primary role of pantomime in our human evolution or in our human development, but rather what is the... I'm looking out the window because there appears to be an elephant on the wall opposite there, but maybe it's not. But rather, as we go along, in some sense, you can each be thinking about your own answer. Have you been focusing on the elephant, or have you been developing a sense of touch, which is contributing to the leg or the trunk or the tusks of that elephant of what I would suggest is the shared human communicative and interactive condition? Now, I use this slide from Wendy Sandler, who used this for her discussion of Israeli Sign Language. And what she is suggesting is that often when we talk about sign language, the use of the hands and the arms in communicating aspects of a true human language, what we neglect is that all these other aspects, the use of the eyeballs and the head, facial expression of the upper and lower face, the torso, and not just the hand which is making the sign, but the non-dominant hand. And so essentially my view is that pantomime engages all of these. Now, the authoritative definition of pantomime from this very university is the following, and what I want to do is try and suggest why I think it's a very good definition, but why there are a couple of things I'm a little worried about. Okay? So, let's just look at it together. Pantomime is a non-verbal mimetic, I've emphasized that, and non-conventionalized means of communication, which is executed primarily in the visual channel by coordinated movements of the whole body, but which may incorporate other resources, most importantly, non-linguistic vocalizations. They're acts of improvised communication that holistically refer to a potentially unlimited repertoire of events or sequence of events displaced from the here and now. And I'm going to suggest, and we're going to be debating, I believe, this afternoon, to what extent we want to take that or offer alternatives. But I want to just start immediately by saying that much of our emphasis on pantomime will be taking some behavior, and then you step back from the actual object you're acting upon and just show the movements as a way of communicating about the behavior that you're now showing. But to make pantomime really useful, we also have to be able to refer to objects by sketching its contours. So I'll be coming back to that. So this is not a disagreement with or a correction to the definition. It's just to remind ourselves that it's not purely behaviors in the absence of an object. We may need to pantomime what object we're talking about. Okay. Now, and then the next thing I want to notice is that Anne Russon has observed behavior in great apes that we might describe as pantomimes. There's a lovely video she has in which at the zoo a young woman is sitting combing her hair, and I think it's an orangutan is observing her, and then the next day the girl comes back and the orangutan goes like this and looks happy when the girl starts combing her hair again. So another issue for this afternoon is, do we want to say, no, and that's not pantomime? Or do we want to say, no, we really need to understand that pantomime is a very rich field and that we really need to distinguish what sort of pantomime that is, as distinct from the sort of pantomime we tend to emphasize in thinking about it as a human or proto-human capacity. So I think what's missing for what I think is our shared sort of pantomime for today and tomorrow is that it's not part of an open, mutually understood system for communication. It's not that here I am in a novel situation, I need something, and I freely, perhaps even subconsciously generate a pantomime. It is that an occasional pantomime occurs, but it doesn't have that role as a received system of communication among the group. So I think that's the distinction, perhaps, that lets us learn from Anne without insisting that what she talks about is not pantomime. No, it's not a certain kind of pantomime. Okay. So I want to leave, now the definition we got, the official Torum definition says you can bring in vocalization. I want to leave it out of my discussion because I explicitly want to understand, as one of the challenges of the evolution of language, to what extent the non-vocal system alone could do it, and to what extent the vocal system then came in as a separate system. So I'm going to insist from my definition of pantomime that there's no vocalization in it, and I can then ask, how could vocalization become recruited into a system of communication based on pantomime? And I'm not going to do it today, but there is a controversy of a sort of, oh, humans like birds and whales got vocal control and then they learned how to use it for communication and pantomime's just on the side, versus the, well, look, other apes and monkeys don't have flexible vocal control and learning, so, but they do have flexible manual control and learning, so we're going to develop a theory, and that's the version that I adhere to or argue for, in which the use of the hands and face to communicate is primary, and then it took later evolution, when there was an adaptive advantage of beginning to make arbitrary gestures, to begin to refine the control of the vocal system to enrich the system of gestures. So that's another controversy, but that's why I would prefer to leave vocalization out when I talk about pantomime, because I want to see these as two separate challenges. Okay. And now I just want to focus finally, I think, for this definitional part on this sorry, how do I go back? Yeah, I want to focus on this potentially unlimited repertoire of events. Because what I want to insist is that, yes, it may be unlimited, but it's not as unlimited as languages. There's a real difference. And so somehow, in a sense, defining what you can achieve with pantomime without conventionalization becomes an important part. So the example I can use immediately is, if I want to pantomime bird flying, I might do this or I might do this. But what if I want to pantomime bird not flying? or if I want to something else flying, but it's not a bird, then I'm in trouble. So that's where we have to begin conventionalization. I have an example, I think, on a later slide, but I'll do it now. My accent in American Sign Language is atrocious, but the basic idea is this is a sign which sort of is somewhat iconic for plane. And in American Sign Language, if you do this in place, back and forth, that's the sign for plane, and if you do this in an arc, it's the sign for flying. And so you've taken what might have started as an iconic pantomime and then conventionalized how you will mark it. I was told yesterday that this sign in Polish is for tea, Polish Sign Language, and in Italian Sign Language it's for coffee. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's nice of the idea that a particular action could then be conventionalized within a community in different ways. What is in your cup, sort of thing. Okay, so, and then finally, to indicate the challenge of getting from pantomime to language or whatever else, a pedagogy or a full narrative, is most of us have played charades, and we know how hard it is. It might take minutes of several people attempting to understand what a charade is, and that's even a pantomime that is formalized for people who know language and where some of the clues can talk about sounds like as well as I am trying to look like. So this is just to say why I think we have to be very careful about when we say potentially unlimited repertoire displaced from the here and now. We have to ask ourselves, pantomime before conventionalization, how far can it get in opening up the repertoire? And then what had to happen in human evolution before that? Again, a topic that Corbelis and Sudendorf have talked about is this issue of going beyond the here and now, mental time travel. Another valuable discussion topic, but one I won't be able to get to today, but some of you may bring up later. Okay. And finally, there is a key ambiguity in using the term pantomime, and I'm going to introduce the ad hoc term basic pantomime. So if I pantomime picking up a mug and drinking from it, I'll call that a basic pantomime. If I want to show you something about making the tea and then drinking it and then washing up, then that would be a pantomime in the extended sense. So I just want to say that sometimes when we're talking, it looks as if we're focusing on just one little piece to convey a request or part of teaching something, or maybe a little bit of a proto-conversation or proto-narrative. But at other times, we really want to refer to a whole sequence of pantomimes. And one of the arguments I'm going to make is that pantomime itself cannot put the pieces together in interesting ways. You basically say, look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this, and then you need conventionalization on the path to something like language to be able to chunk this in different ways, refer to the chunks later, put the chunks in some sort of relationship. So that's the sort of story there. I just want to close, I think, this introduction with an aside, and that is that dance clearly fits in to this story. Maybe Steve Brown can tell us more about that if he zooms into us. Because dance, on the one hand, I think comes in from just the rhythmic enjoyment of sonically evoked patterns, but it's also an expressive system with roots in pantomime. And, well, let's skip the rest. Oh, one other thing I want to just notice is that an important thing about dance is that we understand that people may dance around just because of the pleasure of dancing. It's just for themselves. But then we have dance where you pay attention to what the other is doing. And this is the question for pantomime, is perhaps when you go back to Anne Russon's work and the ape does this pantomime, it's not clear that it's a communicative behavior unless there's a human who is totally different from a normal ape who can be responsive to it. So developing a culture in which you can not only pantomime relatively complex things, but also can expect somebody else to get what you're pantomiming and perhaps respond appropriately. That is another cultural shift, and whether it requires a biological shift or only a cultural shift is again a topic that we might consider later on. Okay, so I have given too many talks on my own theory, and I don't want to repeat that by giving a full talk. I just want to try and give a minimal number of slides to say what are the points or terminologies that emerge from what I've been thinking about at greatest length that might be useful markers for the way we discuss the other two topics that I will be getting to, pedagogy and narrative, and that you'll be getting to later on. So the first thing I want to talk about is the difference between simple imitation and complex imitation. So the notion is that apes can learn new skills, and what Burns suggested was that behavior parsing was important, that the young ape would recognize that there are sort of intermediate steps that are achieved. So a bit like our discussion about basic pantomime, there are sort of basic things you have to see, and they go on to the next basic thing, and they go on to the next basic thing. And so there are markers for these that are observed by the ape, but the mother ape or the alpha ape or whatever is not teaching. There's no attempt. The kid catches what they can. But in simple imitation, the notion is then that they notice what the sub-goals are, but then it's basically trial and error for them to come up with that. And now what I suggest is that what we have is this, so scared to press a button, that firstly, complex action recognition. Our ability in language, for example, is that we can recognize this flow of sound as actually based off familiar pieces of sound, words. But then we have the tools for how to put them together. So the minimum we have is that it's sort of taking this behavior parsing and raising it to a new limit of being able to recognize when something is made of separate actions. And then, crucially, imitation is when we can not only recognize that, but we can also use that as the basis for adding new actions to our repertoire. And they may and it may be that by looking at the details, not just what was the sub-goal you got to, but how did you move to get to that sub-goal, that provides the crucial bridge. So it's that package that I suggest we end up with. And the one thing I have to add here, and we'll reiterate, is that it's not that there were creatures that only had simple imitation, a switch was thrown, and then there were people who had, or proto-humans who had complex action recognition and imitation in all its subtlety. We're talking about a graded variable of complexity as this advances. Okay. Okay, this is basically the slide I talked about. I pantomimed, perhaps before, the difference between airplane and fly in American Sign Language, and just to make the point that the progression from pantomime to sign language requires, whether you're learning it individually or in its historical emergence of the language, a transition from relatively iconic performances to conventions that will allow one to communicate different things. That could be confused. So in a sense, the transition from what I call proto-sign from pantomime is the notion that you are both reducing ambiguity and reducing motor effort, while doing so in a way that remains clearly distinguishable by your observer. All right, so this is just the mirror system hypothesis. We have, how do we get to simple imitation? How do we get to complex imitation and recognition? How do we get to pantomime? How can proto-sign and proto-speech emerge together? So my suggestion is that while I would argue that proto-sign emerges from pantomime in a simple form to provide the scaffolding for the emergence of proto-speech, nonetheless there's an expanding spiral as we become more adept at conveying meaning in vocal gestures and manual gestures, and each new skill in either domain feeds back into the other, so we have an expanding spiral. And then finally, as part of this package, we have the notion of cultural evolution, the suggestion that once our ancestors had all this, the transition from what we call proto-language to language was one that occurred through cultural evolution, with perhaps some minor Baldwinian evolution thrown in, but basically no real innovations required. So I just want to not give you an exposition of all that stuff. I've talked about it and written about it too much, but just to come up with 3 theoretical ideas that should be part of our discussion in what follows, and whether or not I use them the right way in my particular theory. So, subdividing categories. I, for example, had to use the 2 categories, simple imitation and complex imitation. If I just talked about imitation without an adjective, I couldn't develop the evolutionary argument. And we've already talked earlier about different forms of pantomime, so part of that's going to be saying, as I said, is what is it that I mean by pantomime? And that's fine then, you can use it that way. But if I use it differently, you don't need to argue, no, you're wrong, that's not pantomime. You can say, oh, that's your kind of pantomime. What's the relationship between the 2 of them? What can we learn from understanding that there are these different aspects? The next thing is this terminology of proto-language and language, but in fact, I'm going to insist there are plural. I'm not going to say there was a first proto-language and that led to the first language. Many different tribes came up with different proto-languages, systems of gesture, vocal and manual, extracted from pantomime and daily experience, and that led to diverse languages. But that's going to be the same thing. My brief talk on narrative, which is going to be far too brief, is based on reading some material by Francesco Ferretti and getting worried about his notion that humans had thought and narrative before they had language. And my very brief argument, because I ran out of time for my slides, is going to be basically, no, we had proto-narrative very early, but we didn't have narrative in the modern sense where you can say Proust's narrative inspired by tasting the Madeleine is blah, 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 blah. Or, okay, so that idea of this prefix proto may be quite useful for some of our discussions, and it may be useful both for those of us talking about the evolution of communication, but also those talking about acquisition by the child. And it may be, say, well, the child of 1 has proto this or that, but does not yet have what we would consider language. And then the third term I think is very useful, based on these 2, is this notion of the expanding spiral, the idea that as we look at various skills that humans have, whether, as I say, the infant developing to a child, to an adult, or the ancestors, the proto-humans becoming modern humans, this expanding spiral, the development in one area provides opportunities for expansion in another area, which provide tools for expansion in the first area, and so on. So again, we don't have concepts before we have language. We have a few concepts before we have language. And then language allows us to develop more and more abstract concepts and communicate about them. Okay. So this is, I think, the last slide of my part of my talk. And I just want to emphasize that in many discussions of language, what I think is the basic property of language is not even explained. And that is, how do we go from proto-words? Okay, so the idea is that we've got, if we think of pantomime, a basic pantomime, okay, then the notion is that corresponds to a proto-word. in a proto-language. As that becomes conventionalized, whether it's a proto-sign or something in proto-speech, you've basically come up with some performance that reminds you of something that we might today express in a sentence or a phrase. But the essence of language is that we have words. They can be tagged with semantic and syntactic categories, and we can combine them using grammar, a set of constructions, and we can use this to have novel meanings based on the meanings of the words and the meanings implicit in the construction employed. And if we were to trace the history of language, of getting more and more complex proto-languages which become less and less simple languages, no hard boundary, then we would be seeing all these clever inventions like how to talk about the past and the future, and how to talk about the mental disposition of others and not just about what we see around us. I mean, you know, how can you pantomime? Yesterday it seemed to me that Jim was thinking unkind thoughts about Sue. If anybody wants to perform that later in the discussion period, I would be very happy to see it. But I think this just indicates all the resources that had to be added. Or another example that I was discussing is that kids who in a few decades with their teachers and with influence from the outside culture and from people coming in from other sign language communities developed Nicaraguan Sign Language. And it seemed to me that the whole business of how much you need to be able to create a language in a few generations is signaled by the word Thursday. And if you just think of what it would take to create a framework in which that is a meaningful word in terms of cultural practice, that provides the context in which the child develops, so that one can get to this age. Maybe, you teach them how to use the calendar, but that requires pointing down one column in the month for the calendar, and that's Thursday. Well, how do you sign it? It doesn't matter how you sign it. I think for the Nicaraguans, it was, well, that was market day in their community, so they conventionalized somehow going to the market as their sign. But I blather on, I'm sorry. So then finally, for me, one of the points was parity. There's not much point in saying something new if no one can understand it, and yet when we talk about pedagogy, we don't need parity, right? If you're teaching somebody to do something, then your skill as a teacher may involve your ability to pantomime in rather subtle ways that make clear to the student what they are meant to do. But the student doesn't have to acquire that skill, so there's no parity in the communicative system. They're just acquiring the skill of stone cutting or whatever is involved. But there is the suggestion is that there is another expanding spiral between having more and more words coming along with constructions and more complex worlds in which we live. So, but what do we pantomime or talk, sign about? And so the rest of the talk is going to be bringing in these topics of pedagogy and pantomime. And I'm not claiming any expertise in this, because in some sense it might be said that my approach that I've just summarized for you so briefly didn't say much about pedagogy, and I think there's one section that really gets into pedagogy and says virtually nothing about narrative. So when I introduce these concepts, it's not to criticize what other people have been doing, but more perhaps to criticize myself. It's saying I'm trying to understand what I can take from them if I continue to develop this framework, because I don't think of MSH as here is the truth, it must not change, but rather it is itself an evolving attempt to understand the origin of language. Okay, so pedagogy. Now, pedagogy and communication are clearly related. So if we refer to Peter Jadenforsch, we can do some nice alliteration. Peter's Pantomime Perspective on Pedagogy singles pantomime as demonstration from pantomime for communication more generally. And so again, we can begin though to think about this in relation to the demands on language, that when training in a novel action, you start with demonstration. So the object is there, you can see different parts of the object, you can see an action of the demonstrator conforming the hand or hands to the different parts of the object, you can see the movements involved, you can see something about the duration of the movement, the targeting of the movement, the speed and force of the movement. Right. But the idea is that as you go along, the student might be very good at some things, so then you might reduce that detailed pantomime to a proto-sign that just says, oh, do A, good, do B, oh, now let's concentrate on C. And then you would get back into that detailed pantomime as performance. And now, as I suggested before, you may need not only to demonstrate the actions, but once you're pantomiming rather than demonstrating, then you may have to not only talk about the actions, but the affordances that, and the objects that are being chosen for targets for the next action. And so, over time, the suggestion is that there's going to be a vocabulary which supplements, focuses, or replaces overt demonstration. But here is the crucial bifurcation. At last we come to the topic of the abstract and title that I submitted to the organizers. And that is, well, leaving apart the fact that I just, leaving aside for a moment, well, forever in my talk, some of you may bring it back, is the issue of facial expression. But I just wanted to make one observation about facial expression, because it brings in the dimension of facial expression of emotions, which is a system that we think of as shared with other species. And again, in Ferretti's talk, he sort of thinks about theory of mind as something that was in place, as narrative was in place, as the basis for pantomime to build on. But I think what's rather interesting is that if you become a good teacher, one of the things you have to learn is to develop a communicative system of facial expression. So instead of saying, oh my God, what have you done, with a facial expression, you say, yes, that's good, try again, try again. And so learning how to express emotions that you are feeling yourself, and how to express an emotional appearance that is conducive to the conversation is itself an important part of the developmental or the evolutionary trajectory that we're concerned. But the distinction that I want to do, the bifurcation, is that in pantomime as demonstration, it's the trajectories, the actual trajectories, the indication of where you're going, how fast are you going, what force you are applying. That's what's crucial. Whereas on the path to language, for pantomime as communication, then you don't want all that. You want to just reduce it. And as we saw in the case of the plane versus aeroplane sign, but in any conventionalization of pantomime, if you're using it to remind people of something, then you want to throw away all the distracting trajectory and just maintain that part of the trajectory that is, well, shall we say quasi or proto-symbolic. So in that aeroplane example, yes, you have to have this trajectory rather than this trajectory, but it's not the force details, the pattern details that matter. There are subtleties there, but let's leave it at that. And as I've already said, that for pantomime as demonstration to be effective, you don't need parity. You want the student to understand what you're doing as a teacher, but you don't want the student necessarily to be able to repeat the gestures, whether pantomimic or more formalized, that emerge. Okay. So, blah, 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 blah. Okay, I think that's enough. But now, here's the crucial thing, the importance of chunks. One of the strange things about our education is that a lot of it is devoted to things that we consider to be totally useless while we're learning them. And then eventually we learn it's worthwhile. We learn the letters of the alphabet, for example. And there's I mean, why would an ape want to learn the letters of the alphabet? Why What is the social situation that forces us to want to learn, or at least need to learn, the letters of the alphabet? But going back to again find the traces of this, we would say that I think as skills became more complex, then an important aspect of developing pedagogy was to say, all right, you know how to do this, and later on we'll learn how to do this, so you see me demonstrating the whole skill. But really, you've got to really get good at this if you're going to master the whole thing. So now let's forget this that leads up to the initial state, let's forget this, and let's just concentrate on learning that. So here's a chunk. But what does that mean? It means that eventually, in communication, you want to be able to refer to a chunk once it's mastered, and you don't want to do it by going through a very quick repetition of everything in the chunk. You need to abstract from that some useful proto-sign or proto-speech or other little phrase that will summarize that chunk, so that now you can say, okay, today we will skip this chunk and let's focus on that. Or, I want you to show me how good you are at that chunk. Or, why don't you just go as far as that chunk but start at the beginning? And so this is already, I think, the beginning as we think about pedagogy. In relation to pantomime, we can see that we're moving not only to the conventionalization of particular basic pantomimes, but we're also moving towards some form of hierarchy, that actions have a hierarchy in them, but just putting one pantomime after another does not yield that hierarchy. You have to say, this is the particular thing I do here, 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 and here. And now you have to be able to begin to say, okay, well, here, oh, here's the reminder, here's the pantomime, here's the reminder, and so on. And you have to be able to begin to say things, and we begin to move from the immediate here and now, go back to part 3, don't go back to the beginning, don't go on to part 5. So I'm hoping all of you are going to explain all this in detail by the end of tomorrow. All right. Okay. All right, so to finish this pedagogy thing, I just want to show that a concept or a distinction that came up in the mirror system hypothesis does seem to me to be relevant here. That in some sense, action is synthetic. We put together diverse actions into an overall behavior. But the problem is that as we get skillful at something, we increasingly elide from one to another. And one of the problems in learning a foreign language is you can't tell where one word ends and the other begins. So a skill, so while our acquisition of the skill is in some sense synthetic, our mastery of the skill has to be analytic. What are the pieces? How do they fit together? And then as we get good at the skill, again, we perform that synthesis of going from focusing very carefully on one action to smoothly putting the actions together. So here's the comment. This is hard enough. Oops. This is a skill I have not mastered, I apologize. This is hard enough when the observed behavior combines known and mastered actions. However, it becomes much harder when trying to learn a new skill. And so we see that what the teacher is doing in pedagogy is not simply pantomiming a sequence of actions, but actually slowing down the sequence, emphasizing the transition from one action to another. So again, we begin to see some structure beyond mere pantomime to pedagogical pantomime. And so we again get into this thing of, it's not just there's one thing, pantomime, that depending on what we're looking at, there are different things that become important. And so our study, as your talks will, I'm sure, demonstrate, will be, I have focused on the tail of the elephant. No, here's the trunk of the elephant. But hey, buddy, there's an elephant there, and it would be nice to know which elephant, or what an elephant is. All right. So, a lead into narrative. For Peter Jardenfors, the emphasis was to suggest that pantomime was important for pedagogy and language, but pedagogy came first. And I just want to list, here, humans built fires, prepared food, kept the campsites tidy and habitable, found water, cared for the young, disposed of the dead, went scavenging for big game, went hunting for big game, and so on. And I suggest that each of these would have been an impetus for using pantomime and beginning to develop some conventionalizations. And so jargon I've introduced to myself, I don't know if anybody else uses it yet, but it is a micro-proto language, so that rather than thinking about there being even a single community having one language, there can be different groups within the community who have their own language. And I was intrigued to learn recently from Danny Adone, who studies sign language, that in Australia there are tribes which have both a spoken language and a sign language, but the sign language for men is different from the sign language for women. And I think that just seems to be a little fossil, if you will, of this notion that we shouldn't think about somehow growing an all-purpose language, but the idea of how did we, in different habitats, with different skills, with different subgroups, develop micro-proto-languages. And then the suggestion would be that eventually, no matter what secrets were being held within each group, the interchange between the subgroups provided a pressure for developing more and more proto-words, more and more constructions, and the emergence of a language that might have been relatively simple and also relatively idiosyncratic. Okay. So the last part will be brief because I don't have too much to say, but that may not stop me, I'm sorry. All right, so I started from a recent handbook paper by Francesco called The Narrative Origins of Language, and he says that narrative was prior to language in human evolution. And his key move is that pantomime enabled early humans to share narratives before the emergence of language. As I say, my process is not so much to criticize Francesco, but to say, hey, I didn't really talk about narrative or conversation in my original thinking about the emergence of language, so maybe I should. But we can perhaps start a conversation based on what we learned from Francesco and what we learned from trying to integrate it with what we've discussed earlier in this hour. So my first point is that ad hoc pantomime could only offer very simple narratives, and the capacity for narratives as we know them today has emerged in an expanding spiral with the emergence of language, but with the emergence of social complexity, the emergence of physical complexity, and so on. So this is just to give a list of the things that, as I parodied with just one challenge earlier, to give a full account of our current use of language and narratives, we need to add to the here and now the displacement from current actions to talk about past and future actions. That's been sort of the concern of Corbelis and Studendorf. To talk about things and attributes as well as actions, I think that's pretty clear. The structuring of episodes, but then the sharing of others' perspectives, the motivation to communicate in both directions, not to mention abstraction, and the ability to create functional worlds. And I think each of these presents challenges which may have been addressed in different parts of the literature, but bringing them together has not always been done. And I can see a smile over there because I've done it, he thinks, and I'll tell you about it. Okay, so here are two claims that I thought were misleading. Thought precedes language. Mimesis allows our ancestral relatives to tell stories in the absence of language. And again, proto this, proto that, expanding spiral. Here's one of the reasons I find them misleading. This is a wonderful book by Laura Polich about the emergence of the deaf community in Nicaragua, based from a year she spent there. And her subtitle is a quote, translated from Nicaraguan Sign Language into English. With sign language, you can learn so much, because here were these people without language, and there was just not that much experience they could have or share with those around them. So another, as I've already mentioned, the difficulty of charades makes clear the challenge of ambiguity. So conventionalization was crucial to increase expressiveness. So what I'm saying is that I really want to understand, much better than I do, the pressure of telling stories. I mean, there are certainly lots of papers on how the motive to tell stories is part of the ancestral condition. But what really would be a proto-story? and what changes in social structure, including proto-language onto language, were required to develop the ability to tell more and more subtle stories. Okay, my point then is to accept that proto-narrative, whatever that is a missing ingredient. And I think I'm just babbling on here. There's a discussion of who said it, but I think I could make the same quote, which is, if only I had more time, I could have written less. So here's a demonstration. So I think what's in there is, but perhaps the most important property of language is that you can create new worlds with language as distinct from miming what already exists. And that's the crucial challenge for us. And what's interesting about pedagogy, if we relate it to the development of a skill, there we have the interaction between somebody discovering or developing the way to create an object that had never been made before, and then you can challenge yourself to say, well, what does that require in changing perhaps cognitive skill, and what might that require in the way of changing communication? So our ancient record of proto-humans is concerned with the Oldowan stone manufacture, where basically you took a stone and you chipped it, and the flakes were what were important to use for cutting, versus the Acheulean, where you had a stone and you cut it, and the flakes were rubbish, and it was the shape you got that was important. And then you got onto the stage of putting things together, so you could get a stone tip, and you had the technology to either glue it or bind it to a stick to make a more effective spear. And so it's not just that language can let you create new worlds, it's that circulation between the built environment, the making of tools, the making of buildings and so on, and the development of language to describe that, and then moving beyond not just the here and now to the past and the expected future, but to fictional worlds. All this provides so many rich challenges for us to bring narrative into our story, but not a narrative of, oh, we had narrative, we had thought before we had language, but rather, what were the basic conditions, the proto-narratives, the proto-thought, the proto-behavior that existed that then allowed us to, in these expanding spirals, build larger cultures, larger languages, more imaginative narratives. So let me just summarize, and then a concluding slide, by saying that parts 1 and 2 are basically the parting paths. There I got another alliteration, pantomimes partially parting paths. So I hope you appreciate the richness of language. See, you can't pantomime. Well, you actually can, because there are poetry slams for signes, right? Where the rhymes are in terms of the movement rather than in terms of the... Okay. Anyway, pantomime, so path 1 is the conventionalization to proto-science as possible stepping stones to proto-language. And there the idea is that you begin to throw away details of trajectory as indicative of how to carry out an action and just preserve a sort of sign phonology. I just need enough to distinguish one proto-sign from another, but the actual details are not that I am showing you how to perform the action, I'm just showing enough, so as in our flying example. Versus in pedagogy, it's still useful, as I've suggested, to have the conventionalized proto-signs that throw away the trajectory, but in general, pedagogy is going to be very much concerned with keeping the trajectory information in detail from the pantomime, and then developing it as a tool for helping the student adjust to the current circumstances by going more slowly or more quickly, more forcefully, coming in from a different angle, and so on. And it's interesting, as I stand here before you, that we do preserve, in addition to our use of language, we have co-speech gestures. So I might say it was this big or it was this small, and there we do have a complement to our words and grammar version of language, these abilities to gesture. And in fact, sign, you can again distinguish between signing and co-sign gestures, where the use of the hands and so on is not to convey a sign of the language, but to decorate it in the way we're using co-speech gestures. And if you will forgive me, a pun I was quite proud of, but I don't know that anybody got, was in a paper commenting to somebody who was talking about co-sign and co-speech. I said, how do we know that all this talk about co-sign and co-speech is not going off at a tangent? Anyway. I still fail, but never mind. All right, so then in addition to the advertised dichotomy or bifurcation, I emphasized the challenge of thinking about how, we also have to think about putting the pieces together, the ways in which the mere sequencing of one thing after another in a sequence of basic pantomimes eventually has to come up with subtle structures, such as the example from chunking as an important tool for pedagogy, where you don't want to have to go very fast through the pantomime of the chunk if you want to remind the student of that chunk. And then finally, I will close with an advertisement or an advertisement, is that I think the same abilities of building on pantomime also lead to the capacity for drawing when you combine the pantomime of object contours with the ability to copy patches of shading and color. This may well have started with the use of ochre to decorate the body as a way of adding patches and color to the technology of pantomime. So the last slide is the commercial. On the left, for a paper in which I discuss this, in the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Symbolic Evolution, which is the same handbook that includes the paper on narrative by Francesco Ferretti that I was talking about, and on the right is what I've been talking about in the Czech Republic and Poland for the last 2.5 weeks, is that I've become very intrigued in thinking about when brains meet buildings. This is a photograph, by the way, that I took in Berlin and realized that it was a perfect match for the title of the building. But it's the issue of what's going on in the brain of a person who experiences the built environment, what goes on in the brain of a designer, an architect, thinking about innovations in the built environment, and off to the side, what happens if you try to make a smart building in some sense. But a lot of what I've said today, surprisingly, has resonances with those issues of the evolution of the built environment and the evolution of our capacity to talk about and design the built environment. So thank you very much for your attention and for your invitation.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for a great talk. It made me feel very well because I agree with almost everything. But perhaps other people have questions.
No, speechless.
Yes.
For the Zoom people. Yes. Thank you very much, Michael. It's not surprising that we agree so much, given that we have collaborated and read each other's work. And as we see this afternoon, we're talking about narratives, we're going simple narratives. to complex characters, and some of the issues complex characters, including acronology and emphasis of the ones you're emphasizing. But, and some of this terminology, some of this is just terminology, trouble versus simple. My question is, it was on the previous slide when you said that the pantomime started as an ad hoc performance based on, but not apart from interaction with the object. And then your path one was in the absence of the object, or language, right? This is what I didn't understand, because pantomime already can function in the absence of the object. I can speak on the microphone without the microphone of the object, but if I was pantomiming,
Yes. No. My point is simply that you pantomime because you have an action. I mean, the source of pantomime was not that somebody thought about novel actions. The origin was that you conveyed something you would do by doing the movement in the absence. So if we're trying to give it an evolutionary account, we have to understand the ability to do the actions that are de-objectified, if you forgive the word, to make a pantomime. That's all I was saying. But then the problem is that if the pantomime is only the actions in the absence of the object, then you have the problem of saying, are you trying to tell me about the object, but which object? And so in some cases you may need to invent a non-action oriented pantomime to talk about, to distinguish the object.
It's the action object distinction, the airplane.
Yeah, for that. And of course then you get to other things where pantomime is basically impossible. Now how do you pantomime blue? There you get into more of the evolution of deixis, so you can point to things and then you come up with an arbitrary gesture. So in American Sign Language, in fact, the gesture is a simplification of the signing of B and L from bleu or blue, and nothing to do with pantomime, and in fact relying on a circumambient language. So that's what I was saying. I wasn't claiming that the action or the original actions were part of pantomime, but I was saying they provided the foundation. And watching, if we look at apes, there are some gestures, and that's a whole other talk. And we have Anne Russon's discussion too. But if a child is learning a new skill as an ape or a monkey, they do it by observing the action on the objects. And so coming back and saying, I can use this to communicate is I think, an innovation. Okay.
Well, perhaps then I say something. Actually, as a comment, that's about vocalization. So a number of people, like including Nick Fay, but also we made a study whether non-linguistic vocalization is useful for pantomime, and where from all I know, all the results are negative. Like, for example, it doesn't increase communicative success if you add non-linguistic vocalization to pantomime. But if you look, for example, at Steve Levinson's work, then perhaps, and this is kind of our idea that we haven't tested, that perhaps non-linguistic vocalization served interactive purposes. For example, emphasizing something or kind of turn-taking. And this is not what you cover in your talk or generally in your thinking about pantomime. But what would you say about that? Kind of the interactive role of vocalization, because the problem is if we look at the baseline and ape communication, non-human ape communication, they do combine vocalizations and gesture.
Maybe a couple, you know.
Well, like there is this work by Frelich, for example, then there would. So what would be, take on that? Whether there were completely different systems and or
Yeah. Well, one of the examples I gave in the book was that when you bite into a piece of fruit and it's sour, you might go, and that would be a vocal gesture that doesn't require the evolution of the vocal tract, but that might become useful as a warning so that when somebody's about to grab a piece of fruit, you say, and they realize they shouldn't pick the fruit because it's not ripe yet. And I talked also about these facial expressions, which can, so in the monkey, you have quite apart from the few vocalizations that a particular group of monkeys may have, as part of their innate repertoire, they have things like teeth chatters and lip smacks. And the group in Pantomime did some studies where they showed that you could relate these orofacial gestures that could be used for not vocal communication, but sonic communication to ingestive actions. And that there were then mirror neurons that seemed responsive to this patch between the orofacial ingestive and communicative gesture. Then, a few years back, Ferrari and Coudet and their colleagues who were in Parma, now in Lyon, did studies where they looked in more detail at the anatomy of the mirror neurons, and they found that whereas the mirror neurons for the manual actions were linked basically to a parietal system and then on to action, there were very distinctive pattern of anatomy for the orofacial neurons that were linked to the limbic system, systems involved in emotion. So, and these areas overlap. So the suggestion then, which they were hinted at and which obviously can be developed, would be that you have a system here that has very little control over sequencing and flexibility, but is strongly linked to emotion and to the orofacial musculature. You have a system here that really knows how to control hierarchically shaped sequences of action. And so in some sense you sort of feel things are in place for an evolutionary progression that will allow emotion to more extensively shade the sequences of action, and sequence of action to come in here to an orofacial system which can then begin to capture more and more ability to control the vocal apparatus and not just the orofacial sonic apparatus. So I think that's a rather lengthy answer, but I think that's the way I would go to try and make sense of how to approach your question.
Question.
I think you're allowed to put the mask down just when you talk.
So that will be much more efficient. Yes, so you mentioned that pantomime is limited in terms of its expressive power, and while I would agree with that, if you take a look at very skilled minds, there appear to be very few things that they are unable to convey, and of course it rests on the modern, cultural scaffolding and stuff. But I would say that maybe it's not so much that pantomime is limited in its expressive power, but it is terribly inefficient to pantomime stuff, right? So it's not like expressive limitation, but I want to suggest that maybe it's the efficiency limitation. So as a way of kind of advertising our talk tomorrow, that would be my comment, or comment question.
I don't know. I guess it's the question of how, again, our sort of adjectives. How far can you get without any conventionalization? So when we play a game of charades or when we watch Marcel Marceau, we have learned that certain types of performance are not yet signs of a sign language, and yet we recognize that they have a certain intent. So I think we'd have to discuss, maybe you can talk more about how far you can get with pantomime to remove some of the barriers I see. But at the moment I think that, as it were, pantomime in the sense of coming up with a performance in the absence of objects that you would do with objects with the intention to communicate can only carry you so far, because of all the ambiguities involved, you may need conventionalizations of the kind we've discussed to carry it further. Do you want to just add a word on an example of where you think pantomime goes further and yet still remains within your definition before we get social conventions?
It would probably take a more skilled mind than I am, and probably more time that we have on our hands
Okay.
right now.
Over a beer later. Yeah.
Okay, so we also have a question on Zoom from Francesco Ferretti, and
great.
Francesco writes, "Thanks, Michael, for the interesting talk. I agree with many of your claims and embrace your suggestion to distinguish between proto-narratives and full narratives, and the intertwined idea that without full language, we have just proto-stories and proto-thought. But I'm not sure that fully fledged language is necessary to convey events that do not exist yet. For example, a tribal chief can tell a hunting scene to organize and plan cooperation between members before its actual realization. What about it?"
I'd say that's a very good response. I mean, I think one of the main stimuli I can see for pantomime and then later proto-language is coordinating behavior. So on that long list I gave, preparing for a hunt would be one of them. I think when Bickerton talked about scavenging, the idea is that somebody comes back from finding a dead elephant, let's say, to continue with my theme, and has to indicate to the tribe that there is an elephant that has died and that it's worth scavenging, and why don't you come? But maybe not having the language of bees, he actually has to be able to point the way. But maybe the beginning of conventionalization, you pantomime the tree over there or the mountain over there, and this begins to provide the transition. But I firstly am very sad you're not here, Francesco, and secondly, I agree with your point that in the short run at least, being able to pantomime an intended behavior is a crucial part. But whether that extends into a long-range future narrative, I'm not so sure. So I hope we can discuss that offline after the conference.
Thank you. So that's the time for the final applause. We are running late, but generally we have a lot of time. So, still we keep those 1 hour slots. We will have a little bit less time for lunch.